Jeez, it was regional championship overload this weekend as events spanned from Brazil to Canada all the way to Prague, as over 1,500 players squared up to sling spells in the modern format. Now, the European event had the most players by far, with 996 people gathered according to Melee, almost doubling the combination of the other two events combined this weekend. Now, partly because there's a lot to cover, and part because of the sheer size of the event, we'll just be focusing on Prague for this metagame breakdown video, and we'll be revisiting Sao Paulo and Ottawa another time, hopefully. But regardless of that, we are going to be breaking down all the different decks in the room, what did well, what was there in force, and what didn't quite meet expectations, as well as they go head-to-head against one another in our recap of our regional championship for the European region. Now, the European RC, as I mentioned, had 996 registered players that cut to day 2 after 8 rounds of play, narrowing down to a top 8 that featured a bunch of duplicate decks actually, and only 4 total archetypes altogether. There were 3 copies of Temur Breach, as well as 3 copies of Boros Energy that were flooding the knockout bracket, with a singleton copy of Eldrazi Ramp and mono green Broodscale, trying to play the hero deck, as some may refer to it, being the solo copies of different deck archetypes in the top 8. Now, unfortunately, it did not bode well for Broodscale, as the lizard-based combo deck was blasted by Boros in the quarterfinals, but Eldrazi Ramp managed to take it down, Boros Energy that is, in the head-to-head on the other side of the quarterfinal bracket. Meanwhile, Breach had a sorta team kill in archetype, while the other Boros Energy deck eliminated a 3rd Breach deck. So that gave us a top 4 where Energy on either side faced off against the remaining 2 archetypes. Now, if you are a fantasy story enjoyer, you might be rooting for the non-energy decks in this scenario. Some people have kind of labeled it the villain of the format, and you'd be rewarded with cheers, as both energy decks fell in the semifinals, which set up the stage for a Breach versus Eldrazi head-to-head finals matchup. And in a 3-game series, it was the 3-color deck that was able to outmaneuver the colorless creature one, or mono green one because it has forest, making the UK-based Alexander Rohan the European national champion. And although that's how the event actually wound up playing out, there were a lot more than just Breach and energy decks in the room. So before we hop into just how many different decks there are, I need to clarify some points in the data, like I always do. Now, again, we are using Melee GG's platform to report our tournament results, giving us 996 registered players across the 2 days of gameplay, as I mentioned earlier. Now, where there are some oddities to the data, such as some players not having round 1 or round 2 results calculated in their overall win rate, we're operating under the assumption that all the relevant data is in there for the round by round play. Additionally, this event has all the players synced up to a deck list, with the large majority of them actually not trolling me and putting together their actual deck name on their deck list, which is surprising actually. So good job to everybody over in Prague. Now, I have gone and cleaned up some of those deck archetypes, such as, for example, taking decks using Faithless Looting in an Esper shell of Goryo's Vengeance and reclassifying it as 4-color instead of pure Esper deck, because some of them just didn't wind up running that card and were Esper purely. So if my data doesn't match up what some of the other breakdowns are showing you on a 1-for-1 basis, these are going to be the reasons why. And then one last caveat, we are not counting ties in the win rate. However, we are counting them towards the total games. So someone who has a 5-2-1 record is going to wind up having the same win rate as someone with a 5-0-3 record. I know some people will eliminate the ties altogether, but this is just the way that I like calculating the results, because it's then just pure win rate over games played. So hold your breath, because we're about to dive into some data where we're showing 85 different deck archetypes in the room with a wide variety of copies being played. We had 37 different deck archetypes that had a single copy in the room, which makes up 43.5% of those deck archetypes. 13 decks in the room had 2 or copies, which is 15.3% of the metagame share, going to 2 copy decks. 3 decks had 3 copies in the room, which, although that wasn't intended, kind of works out to be a little funny that way, because that just goes to show, you know, that there's some symmetry in these numbers here. But that only wound up being a 3.5% of these deck archetypes having 3 copies in the room. Meanwhile, there were 4 decks with 4 copies in the room for a 4.7% share of those archetypes, which left 28 total deck archetypes with 5 or more copies in the room, or roughly a third of them at 32.9%. Now, the expected top decks in the format did show up en masse, with Boros Energy taking the helm with a little more than a quarter of the decks at the event. So it was definitely at the tip top of the iceberg of those 5+ copy decks. Now, behind it in the second most played deck in the room was Dimir Oculus, although in this case it was less than half the number of energy decks, so quite the drop off. 256 compared to 114, 25.7% compared to 11.4% of the metagame share. So although both of these decks were top of the tables when it comes to it, energy dwarfed the Oculus numbers here. Now, Temur Breach received a bunch of hype coming into the event with the help of Mox Opal to fuel the excitement and the engine behind the deck, while Eldrazi Ramp was the big mana deck of choice, both with just under 10% of the metagame share. Now, just to note, as there were a few different flavors of Eldrazi in the room, this Ramp version was the one that is utilizing Utopia Sprawl and none of the Tron lands in its mana base. Tameshi Belcher, Golgari Yawgmoth, and the new kid on the block, Orzhov Blink, all had 34 copies and a 3.4% metagame share at the EURC, which is impressive for the Orzhov deck since it seems to have taken off only a couple of weeks ago. Also, it's 34 and 3.4. I'm not making this up. This is just how Prague went. Mainstay of the format, Amulet Titan, was still alive and kicking, sharing the same 2.8% metagame share as the Ruby Storm deck that has been floating around since MH3's release. Now, rounding out the top 10 decks was Domain Zoo, still hanging on to life as the metagame surrounding it continues to evolve and change. So I guess, you know, throwing down like Scion of Draco is still pretty profitable proposition for 1.9% of the players at this RC. Now, other decks of interest were the 4-color version of the Breach deck, opting for a white splash for Savine's Reclamation to bring something back from the graveyard with a copy, and Teferi Time Raveler out of the sideboard, with 17 copies and just shy of a top 10 presence stat. Affinity also sent 16 copies to Prague off the back of Kappa Cannoneer in addition to Mox Opal, while Hollow One only had 9 copies in the room, despite Faithless looting making that deck a lot stronger and definitely more consistent than more recent iterations of the RNG-based discard deck were. Moving on from just what was in the room, we are going to be ranking things based on their popularity, which is a metric I've created in order to track how popular a deck was at any given event. So that makes sense for the naming convention. It's really easy to take a look at the decks in a room and point out which ones had the most there, but it's important to give context to these metagame share numbers to showcase just how many of a deck were in a room and apply that to your own local events and testing in order to better prepare for them. Now, popularity takes all the deck archetypes in the room, distributes them across a normal distribution curve, and awards a letter grade from S to D based on how many there were compared to all other archetypes at the event. Starting off with the creme de la creme of the S-tier decks, Prague gave us 2 that everyone pretty much aligned on going into the event. Now, we've mentioned them before. Boros Energy and Dimir Oculus were the talk of Modern going into the event, despite one of the decks suffering bans not even a month ago. Now, with a quarter of the room playing Energy, the deck put up an extremely close to 50% win rate, going to show that while it's beatable in its current form, it's also still quite a powerful deck. The same unfortunately can't be said about Frogulus, as the Dimir deck had a 44.9% win rate and struggled to find success against the myriad of decks in the field. The A-tier decks also had just a pair between them, as Temur Breach and Eldrazi Ramp both put up above 50% win rates across almost 100 pilots in the room. The Breach deck in particular had a lot more hype ramping up to the event, as grinders and content creators alike were shoving as many cards with the name Mox as possible into the combo deck, while solidifying the best sideboard plans to attack the hate that it would face. Meanwhile, Eldrazi Ramp kept some of the new additions like Ugin's Labyrinth, but paired it with a classic land-enhancing enchantment in Utopia Sprawl to help power out the powerful creatures. Not a Tron land in sight meant that this was a much greener version of Eldrazi than we've seen in the past, spearheaded by the power of effects on cards such as Sowing Microspawn and Worldbreaker. Now, I feel like this is a trend with Modern events recently, because I feel like this is what happened during my last Modern metagame recap, is we skipped the B tier entirely, as none of the deck archetypes fell between the required 45 and 78 copies in the room to achieve this tier. So, we fall down to C tier, where we find 11 different deck archetypes, showcasing a subsection of players that came to similar conclusions on the deck they wanted to bring, while still being a bit less unanimous as others and potentially a little of that rogue factor to them. Orzhov Blink was one a lot of people were talking about, and something I've slowly been amassing in paper myself that flickered itself into a 51% win rate flat. Meanwhile, that Tameshi Belcher combo deck was able to break even at a 50% win rate, unable to combo off as much as it seems to do whenever you see it on Magic Online or play against it there. Fan favorite Yawgmoth had more decks than I thought would be in the room compared to the other Green Sun Zenith Golgari brews, but it didn't reward too many of its pilots, as the deck had an unfortunate 45.1% win rate on the weekend. Now, similarly, Amulet Titan and Ruby Storm, which are decks that we've seen in the past iterations of Modern, put up lower end win rates too, with the Storm deck falling all the way down to a 39.8% win rate. Not great. It wasn't all bad news for updated versions of last Modern Horizons released decks though, as Domain Zoo ended up with a 54.1% win rate, which rivals that of the event-winning Temur Breach archetype. Speaking of Breach, adding a color actually lowered the overall win rate for the deck, as 4-color Breach had a 49.1% win rate. And the same could be said about Boros Energy compared to Boros, although it's only a 1.3 percentage point difference here, which is not too different. Affinity, as the other Mox Opal deck in the room, struggled with a 45.1% win rate, while the Esper Oculus added white and dropped the win rate down to 40%. Rounding out the C tier of decks was another flavor of Eldrazi, this time actually utilizing the Tron lands, putting up a similar 52.3% win rate across the weekend, showcasing that it might not be the mana base that matters, and it just might be the dang Eldrazi again. Now, there were some decks that were not as popular as these at all, but still put up some impressive results at the RC. So let's switch our gears a bit and highlight the top 10 win rate decks, regardless of how many copies were in the room. Now, just to note for this regional championship, decks that had 18 or more match points made day 2 and kept playing. But day 1 was only 8 rounds, not 9. That meant that decks that ended 5-3-0 or 5-2-1 did not make day 2, despite having a 62.5% or higher win rate. So, as we go through these decks, mind the total number of games played to see if these decks won across both of the days or if they were stopped at day 1, which actually kind of saved their win rate a little bit. Jund Sagavan. Now that's a name I have not heard in a while. Now, deck pilot Per Jones, sorry if I mispronounced your name, took 19th place on what looks like a shot of copium straight to my Boomer Jund veins. Although the deck ran no Bloodbraid Elves for the full throwback, 6 Goyfs split evenly between Tarmogoyf and Nethergoyf joined 2 copies of both Fear of Missing Out, or FOMO, and Dark Confidant, believe it or not, to make a deck that won as much as it made me feel all warm and fuzzy inside. It also leveraged an underused synergy, in my opinion, of the other Titan of the format, Kroxa, alongside Arena of Glory to make a hasty discarding threat from the graveyard. Boros Hammer snuck in with a 66.7% win rate, although the pilot seems to have a little bit of an interesting match history since there are no recorded results for round 1 or 2, making it look like they only played 6 rounds of the event. But like we said, we're operating under the assumption that all these records are correct, so this actually gives them the second highest win rate at the tournament. Now, the normal Hammer affair meets some red sideboard options in this deck with Pyroclasm and Wear Tear for low to the ground and artifact decks. Now, if we look at the overall tournament as a whole, the Azorius version of Hammer only had a 40% win rate at Prague, so I'm not super sold on Hammer in general, although this Boros version may be the way to go if you're looking to shore up some matchups with some sideboard tech, since there are a lot of small things and artifacts floating around right now. Coming up next, a block of 6 decks that had high win rates but failed to make day 2 coming up, with Esper Reanimator kicking us off. This deck was a day 1 staple when Modern Horizons 2 was released, but fell off a cliff shortly after, and the Grief Plan basically made it a non-existent deck even at my local events. Trust me, it's in my binder, picked apart now. However, it popped up at the RC one more time, utilizing Persist alongside Psychic Frog and the non-legendary large creature package of Archon of Cruelty, Ashen Rider, and Sarah's Emissary to end games quickly. Yo dog, I heard you like Reanimator decks. So this time, we're highlighting a Golgari version. Now, Troll of Khazad-dûm, Harvester of Misery, and Phyrexian Flesh Gorger are the options in this version of the deck, while a larger mill package, including Malevolent Rumble and Witherbloom Command, helped this deck put more things into the graveyard than the other versions were. Now, it also ran Emperor of Bones over Priest of Fellright since, well, it's lacking the color white as a creature-based reanimator spell Priest of Fellright utilizes, and instead just went with the mono-black adapt one that Goryo's Vengeance has been using. Emperor of the Bones plays a pretty good substitute role. Out with the green and in with the black was Alex Campbell's take on Grinding Breach, adding the flair of Bassam ibn Ishaq straight from Aspiring Spike's playbook that gave Mox Amber another way to be activated outside of the normal Tamiyo and Emery ways. Now, this allowed the deck to have a little bit more main deck hate for the mirror matchups, in air quotes, as well, with 2 copies of Nihil Spellbomb, as well as 2 copies of Fatal Push for the plethora of small mana creatures in the format, with, 2 extra copies of Fatal Push in the sideboard as well. So that Nihil Spellbomb could also turn into a cantrip, which would then give this Grinding Breach deck, as you know, the more cards it finds, the more cards it can just go through with its deck, a very valid card draw engine in addition to the Mishra's Baubles. Grixis Creativity rolled with the unbanning of Faithless Looting and kept it to 3 colors, using blue as the interactive color, playing 2 main deck copies of both Spell Pierce and Spell Snare to help push through its combo of either Indomitable Creativity or Persist for 4 copies of Archon of Cruelty. This also allowed the deck to run 3 copies of Consigned to Memory in the sideboard for the expected Eldrazi matches at the tournament, and Mystical Dispute for the other interactive counter magic decks. Jeskai Dressed Down took the control shell and put in 4 of the main deck namesake card to allow for cheap Null Drifters, Solitudes, and Phalanges to close out the games. Now, backed up by card advantage from Tune the Narrative and Memory Deluge, the deck maxed out on cheap interaction with Consigned to Memory, Stern Scolding, Galvanic Discharge, and Wrath of the Skies to lock down boards and advance their own cheap game plan even into the mid and late stages of gameplay with all these extra control elements. A mono-white version of the Blink deck also had a 5-win performance, cutting the black cards entirely and just running straight-up tax effects like Thalia, Garden of Thraben into the deck. Now, a main deck copy of Enduring Innocence took advantage of the much lower mana value that the deck has, and a full package of 4 White Orchid Phantoms made the main deck alongside Sarah Paragon to bring back anything that may have gotten killed before being flickered, as well as the ability to recur lands like Ghost Quarter and Flagstones of Trocaire to be able to just get a little bit of extra mana or can make sure you're hitting those land drops. Ending the string of decks that did well, but not well enough to day 2, Samwise combo had 2 decks. one that made 27th place, and one that did not day 2 at all, averaging out to a 59.1% win rate. Now, packing Pioneer Band combo Amalia and Wildgrowth Walker alongside the normal Samwise, Cauldron Familiar, Viscera Seer combo, the higher placing of these decks leveraged pretty much every possible piece of mana producing, food creating, toolbox digging card that you could find to ensure it would combo kill one way or another. This deck also made great use of the recently unbanned Green Sun Zenith, finding both the namesake card Samwise and Wildgrowth Walker, as well as the classic Dryad Arbor angle, or a singleton Sylvan Safekeeper in the main deck to protect the combo. Not to mention a plethora of toolbox options in the sideboard like Collector Oof for all of these artifact decks. Now, last up on the highest top 10 win rate decks is the most winning deck at the tournament with more than 2 copies in the room. Mono Green Broodscale combo. 7 decks in the room combined for a 57.8 win rate, in addition to a top 8 appearance from pilot Theodore Eliasson, as they gave their Lizard a blade and drained their opponents to death with a glaring Fleshraker sitting there, glaring, staring at you, menacingly. Now, if there wasn't enough ways to ping your opponent to death that way, suiting up a Walking Ballista was another way to shoot down your opponents, or maybe just casting Emrakul the Promised End off of all of your Eldrazi spawn tokens. That's about it for the top 10 most winning decks. Now let's go back to those popular decks and look at how the top 10 presence decks at Prague faced off head-to-head against one another. Now, we cut down the matchup matrix this way because these decks were the most played at the event, and therefore you're most likely to encounter them at your own LGS or online as you grind through modern events. Also, this would probably take a very long time if I went over every single one of the 85 archetypes, so yeah, they just don't fit on the screen. Top of the tournament, Boros Energy, most copies of a deck in the room, wound up having an interesting matchup spread. Now, it did have 4 favorable matchups of the top 10 presence decks, beating up on Dimir Oculus, Golgari Yawgmoth, the newer Orzhov Blink deck, and the Ruby Storm deck, which had a rough overall tournament, but it had a losing matchup against the other 6 archetypes in the room. Temur Breach at a 43.2% win rate was a deck that was expected to kind of come in and prey upon some of the slower builds of these energy decks, while the Tameshi Belcher deck was also one of those decks that kind of put together a combo that energy had a harder time interacting with, and therefore only had a 41.2% win rate in that matchup. The one I'm actually very interested in is the only 31 matches of Domain Zoo, where the energy deck had a 38.7% win rate, so the kind of old, better deck in the format is now beating up on the current best / most played deck in the format like Domain Zoo used to be. So I just want to really see way more matches of that one played by some high level players to see if this is just the way it went at the tournament, or if this is something that's actually a deck that can just beat up on energy. Now, the Dimir Oculus deck also had a pretty interesting matchup spread, specifically looking at some of these top 10 presence matchups that are at 28% win rate. This deck struggled against Golgari Yawgmoth and the Orzhov Blink deck, 28% and 28.1% win rate in those respective matchups, as the decks that wanted to kind of toolbox and move its things around, and guess what, were not great when you line up against like Fatal Push and things like that. They were tough matchups for the deck that's trying to just put an Oculus on the battlefield and play a bunch of kind of removal and interaction. Now, speaking of other kind of worse matchups for the Oculus deck, Temur Breach was a 43.5% win rate, and unfortunately it struggled against the most played deck in the room as well in Boros Energy with a 42.4% win rate there. However, one of the top 8 decks and the deck that made the finals, Eldrazi Ramp, the Oculus deck was pretty good against with a 56.9% win rate. And of course, this deck with a bunch of interaction and a decent clock was good into the Ruby Storm deck with a 69.6% win rate in that head-to-head matchup. Temur Breach got a big old power up from the unbanning of Mox Opal, and in combination with Mox Amber, Emry, and Tamiyo can generate a ton of mana and potentially kill someone as early as turn 2 if the thing lines up correctly. And that was pretty good against the top parts of the metagame here in Prague, as both Boros Energy and Dimir Oculus were over 56% win rates with a decent sample size and a nice one against the Dimir Oculus deck. However, there were some decks in the room that the deck that was touted as one of the best going into the tournament did struggle with. Specifically, the Eldrazi Ramp deck was a slightly below 50% win rate matchup for the Temur Breach side of things, which goes to show that some of the parts of the Eldrazi deck were just a little bit too much to contend with, and that they could slow the Temur Breach deck down just long enough to steal some wins. Likewise, the Orzhov Blink deck, which is basically the evolution of a Death and Taxes kind of style build, especially with the ability to play at instant speed off of things like Aether Vial, was a 43.5% win rate for the Temur Breach deck. However, for a deck with one of the highest win rates for these top 10 presence decks, only having 2 slightly unfavorable matchups against the top 10 decks in the room just goes to show that Breach might be the real deal. Utopia Sprawl and a bunch of big Eldrazi had a pretty decent showing at this tournament, having a high overall win rate against the field, but then also having a decent matchup spread against the top 10 presence decks. Now, I say that, but it is not without its own struggles against the most present decks. Now, these kind of very linear beat you up ground of creatures on the ground strategies are often a little bit hard to interact with some specific combo decks like the Ruby Storm deck. Now, Ruby Storm didn't have a great tournament, but it did beat up on Eldrazi Ramp, and as Eldrazi only had a 36.4% win rate against the Ruby Storm deck. Now, it did wind up beating up on other combo decks like Amulet Titan and Tameshi Belcher, where it was on the positive side of a 50% win rate deck there, but it also really preyed upon the Golgari Yawgmoth deck, just running over all those little small creatures before Yawgmoth even hit the battlefield, putting up a 76.9% win rate, one of the highest ones here with a decent size sample size of head-to-head matchups. All right, we kind of talked a little bit of smack about you, Golgari Yawgmoth, so you're next up when we go over these matchup overviews here. Interesting point here, this deck did not play against itself the entire tournament. There were no matches of the mirror match for Golgari Yawgmoth, which can be very interesting to navigate as the pilot and kind of fun to watch as a spectator, so a little disappointed there. But the Golgari Yawgmoth deck did have some very poor head-to-head matchups at this event, specifically the Temur Breach, the Eldrazi Ramp, the Ruby Storm, and the Domain Zoo matchups, where everything was hovering around 37.5% or lower in the head-to-head matchup. Now, it did struggle a little bit against Boros Energy, clocking in at under 50% win rate with a 45.9% win rate, but it did prey upon Dimir Oculus with a 72% win rate in that head-to-head matchup, and was very good against the more newer Orzhov Blink list with a 60% win rate in 10 matches. I'm not really intending to end with the next deck I talk about, but hey, I'm just a segue genius, I guess. Speaking of geniuses, the ones who put together the Orzhov Blink list did pretty well at this event, especially against the Dimir Oculus and Temur Breach decks in the room. 71.9% win rate against Oculus and a 56.5% win rate against the Breach deck. While there were smaller sample sizes of the Belcher and Amulet matchup, the Blink deck did pretty good against those combo decks as well, at 69.2 and 66.7% win rates in those head-to-head matchups. Now, it did struggle a little bit against Energy, falling on the below 50% side of that head-to-head matchup, and did not do too well against big creatures like the Eldrazi Ramp deck, as it was a 34.8% win rate in that head-to-head matchup. It did, however, have a 100% win rate, but in only 3 head-to-head matches against the Domain Zoo deck that popped back up at this event. All right, Tameshi Belcher combo. Good against Energy, 58.8% win rate there. Decent against Amulet Titan, small sample size, 66.7% win rate there. Domain Zoo, broke even. Ruby Storm, 2 matches, 100% win rate. Can't really gain a lot from that kind of head-to-head with the small sample size. The rest of the decks, Don't really know what happened to the Belcher deck. Maybe people just kind of came into this one with a little bit more of a sideboard tech plan against it, but it struggled against the Dimir Oculus deck, really was unfavored against Temur Breach with a 24% win rate in that head-to-head matchup. Couldn't really hold a candle to the Orzhov Blink deck either at a 30.8% win rate in that matchup, and then broke even against Yawgmoth, which is a good place to be, and was only slightly under 50% win rate with a 47.8% win rate against the Eldrazi Ramp deck. Now, I know that there are a couple of different ways you can kind of build the Belcher deck, and I'm not too sure if the one that a lot of pilots settled on was the perfect one for this event. So I would just kind of go back to the drawing board, look at how I'm building my deck, and Tameshi Belcher combo just might be one of those decks that needs to be built for the tournament in order to really succeed, and definitely scales with the pilot knowledge and construction of the metagame that they're going to be playing into. Now, Amulet Titan at this point, if you are an Amulet Titan pilot, you are ride or die until something gets taken away from this deck in the format. You've read Dom Harvey's entire document multiple times over, and you've kept up with the iterations of how it's gone into the Analyst Lotus Field combination of the deck now. You watch Canister's stream and are probably a very long time sub, but unfortunately your deck didn't really hold it together against the top presence decks at the tournament. You set out and did your due diligence in duty in getting a 54% win rate against the Boros Energy matchup, but all the other top decks in the room, save for Golgari Yawgmoth, which we kind of dealt with when that was super popular already, were a bit of a struggle bus. 44.4% win rate against Oculus isn't the worst in the world, but is still on the losing side of the matchup. Similarly, 47.4% against the Eldrazi Ramp deck, so your deck built for speed was not able to beat their deck built for speed on just a head-to-head basis. But most importantly, 39.1% win rate against the Temur Breach deck. This is a very highly talked about deck going into the event, and unfortunately the Titan deck just couldn't go as fast as the Breach deck, nor was it able to kind of hold up to what that deck was bringing in the post-board games either. All right, you thought I was being a little harsh when I was talking about the Amulet Titan deck? Well, the Ruby Storm deck had one of the worst win rates of the tournament for these top 10 presence decks, and actually pretty low win rate overall on the tournament. Now, the deck in and of itself actually played a decent number of mirror matches, unfortunately, having 10 head-to-head matchups where it was just two people storming off at one another, but it did put up a good win rate against decks that struggled to interact with the combo aspect. It played the combo straight-up race against Amulet Titan, getting a 66.7% win rate there, a 63.6% win rate against the Eldrazi Ramp deck, trying to do what it can to maybe blow up some lands before the Ruby Storm deck could combo off, and then a 75% win rate against the Golgari Yawgmoth deck as well. It did have a decent Orzhov Blink matchup with a 60% win rate in just the 5 matches that got played, but the Ruby Storm deck did not do well against the top 3 decks at the tournament, which could speak to why it has such a low overall win rate, including an 18.8% win rate against big talk of the town Temur Breach. And Domain Zoo rounds out this top 10 presence decks, and not only did it do better than I thought it would, or thought it had any right doing, really. I'm kind of stumbling over my words because I'm seeing Domain Zoo here in the top 10 again, but it did pretty well in addition to that against some of the top decks in the room. Now, we talked about Domain Zoo and Boros Energy, and Domain Zoo taking that head-to-head, it was a 61.3% win rate in favor of the Zoo deck. It had a favorable matchup against Dimir Oculus as well, a 55.6% win rate. So Domain Zoo's success could have come off of the fact that it preyed upon 2 of the top decks in the room. Now, it only had a 38.5% head-to-head against Temur Breach, so if you were anticipating Oculus and Energy, you picked the right deck. If you thought Breach was going to be super present, which it was less present than those two, so you thought incorrectly there, the Breach deck does wind up beating up on the Domain deck a bit, so you may have to kind of reconfigure your sideboard plan to try to attack their deck a little bit more if you're anticipating seeing more Breach after, well, it won Prague. Of course, the Domain deck did wind up going head-to-head against the other creature decks on a decent enough level, 52.9% win rate in the Eldrazi matchup, and even though Yawgmoth is a combo deck, it combos through creatures, so it's a 66.7% win rate there. The downside is the Domain Zoo deck only played 3 matches against the Orzhov Blink deck, which is the new hotness, and it won none of them. So this may be a matchup to kind of keep on your radar if you're thinking of sleeving up your Scions again. So that's how the RC in Europe played out. Do you think that there are going to be a lot of adaptations before the RC that happens in North America, or the US specifically, because there was one in Canada already, but the one that's going to be happening in Portland in about a little less than a month from now? What decks do you think will see more or less play because of said adaptations? Let me know down in the comments below, and of course, while you are down there, you can be sure to thumbs up the video so you can show everybody that you are excited to tackle Modern Season soon. Now, I also want to take the moment to shout out all of my members for their support who helped put this video specifically and all of these videos together on my channel. Thanks for their help. Now, if you would like to join this fine fellowship and gain access to perks like member first content, personal deck techs, Discord access, and your name over here on the list, you can just click the join button down below the video or on my home main channel page. And as always, you can feel free to tap that subscribe button to stay up to date on my latest deck techs, metagame analysis, and just general Magic content. We'll see you at the next RC.